Gavin Henning is a professor of higher education at New England College in New Hampshire, where he directs the Doctor of Education and Master of Science in Higher Education Administration programs. He has over 25 years of experience in student affairs, assessment, and institutional research, and regularly presents and consults on these topics. Gavin is a past president of both ACPA, College Student Educators International, and the Council for the Advancement of Standards in Higher Education, which is CAS. In addition, he has published numerous articles, book chapters, and books, including The Impact of Sense of Belonging in College, Implications for Student Persistence, Retention, and Success, which he co-edited, and Reframing Assessment to Center Equity, Theories, Models, and Practices, which he co-edited and co-authored 3 chapters. He is the recipient of the 2023 NASPA George Q. Outstanding Contribution to Literature and/or Research. Gavin earned his PhD in Education Leadership and Policy Studies from the University of New Hampshire, and I'm honored to introduce him now. Please give him a hand.
So again, my name is Gavin Henning. I use he, him, his pronouns, professor of higher education at New England College. I never intended to be a faculty member. Actually, in my doctoral program, I told my chair I never want to be a faculty member because I love working in student affairs and I love working in assessment. But things happen, life changes. And retention has certainly been one of the topics that I've been very interested in. And it started in 2014 when I had the opportunity to review the book Rethinking College Student Retention by John Braxton and his colleagues. And it really got me thinking about the intersection between student affairs and then academic affairs, because I started my full-time faculty position in 2012. And since then, I've been thinking about different parts of retention. I've been involved in retention work on my campus. We have some serious retention issues at New England College and graduation issues. But also the research and the scholarship I do around sense of belonging and equity-centered assessment really dovetails with retention. And also when I think about all the work that we do across the institution, retention is really that common element. It doesn't matter if we're talking with leaders who really want to make more money, if we want to make sure that we really do our moral obligation to help students who we admit graduate. Retention is that common thread across the entire institution. And so what I want to do is talk to you a little bit about sense of belonging. But I've got a ton of resources, so I'll give you a second if you want to take a photo of the QR code or the link. In there, I've got a whole list of all the sources and information I'm referencing today, as well as a bunch of other articles which may be of interest to folks. And also a copy of the slides are in there as well. But as mentioned earlier, I come from a student affairs perspective. I started in student affairs in residence life as a residence hall director, moved into assessment work and institutional research, and now as a faculty member. And so those are the different perspectives I bring to this idea of sense of belonging. So the student affairs piece of it, the academic affairs piece of it, I've involved in student affairs assessment and academic affairs assessment, but also the data piece of it, the institutional research piece, because we really can't do the best job we can for students unless we actually use the data that we have for us, and do a better job with the data that we have, because many institutions don't have really good data, so it really makes it difficult for us to come up with interventions that will support students. So this is really what I'm going to talk about this morning. So I'll talk about some key concepts related to belonging, talk about the outcomes, particularly around student success, retention, and persistence. Talk a little bit about the connection to identities and social identities, as well as what are some strategies, because my guess is you all are interested, so what do you do about this? I buy into the topics, but how do we do that? And then we'll wrap up. But first, I'm going to invite you to think back to college. Think back to your time when you were on campus. Think about a time when you felt like you belonged. What was it like? Was it a specific moment? Was it a group of people? Was maybe a conversation with a faculty or a staff member? What was it that made you feel like you belonged? What was that feeling like? That feeling of connection. Now think back to a time where you didn't belong. What did that feel like? What was the situation, the people? Maybe it was in a classroom. Maybe it was in a student organization or something else. What I want you to do is think about those experiences and keep those in mind as we talk about some of these contents. And also think about the difference between college, yesterday, and today. For some of us, it was a long, long time ago. I think back to my time in college. We had just got rooms in the phone, or the phones in the rooms. There was no cable in the building, no internet. We're typing up papers on a Smith Corona. And if we were lucky, we had the one we could backspace to white out. Our Google were the card catalogs in the library. How many people hated microfiche? If it was on microfiche, I was not going to look at it because it was just too much. And if you don't know what microfiche is, look it up because it is not fun at all. And so, as I tell my students now, things are just so much easier than they were. But not necessarily they are. Things have changed a lot. Campuses have become much more diverse, and that has an impact on belonging. Didn't have cell phones. So I talked to my nieces and nephews. They go, how did you know where to meet people for a party? Well, we told them where we're going to be, and we met them there. And then hopefully they showed up, otherwise we'd be the only one person there. But there are also issues around stress, mental health, very different from when many of us went to college. So while there's some really things that are better in terms of the technology actually causes some challenges that we didn't have to experience. So let me talk a little bit about some key concepts. First of all, a lot of the work around belonging is centered in Nancy Schlossberg's work around mattering. So really about students feeling like they matter. And it's about being connected to other people on campus, being connected to the institution itself, fitting in. When I was doing my master's work back in the early 90s, we talked about fit. Did students fit with the institution? And the interesting thing is we talked about the students fitting, not the institution fitting for students. And there's some other issues or topics that are related. This idea of involvement, engagement, and belonging, because they're not the same thing. They're similar, but they're related. To me, involvement is the activity, so being involved in something. But involvement in and of itself does not lead to engagement. Students could put a lot of time being involved in a student organization, working on campus, maybe even being a resident assistant. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're engaged, that they're putting the emotional energy into the work that they're doing. And even students who are engaged, those who are involved in maybe faculty research, they may be actually the president of an organization, they may be a supervisor in the dining hall and they supervise other student employees, doesn't mean that they feel like they belong. But there is a connection between all of these. But really what makes this complicated is that belonging is really this multi-dimensional construct. There's a psychological element to it, this perception that students feel connected. And this is a challenge with social media today. Students can feel like they have this huge following, but is there really that connection? Have a lot of people, but do they feel that psychological connection? Then there's the cognitive element of it. What do students feel like their role is within different groups in the classroom? And then the affective piece. How does that influence their actions? And then there's also these other elements about sense of safety and sense of community. And those all affect belonging. Let's complicate it even more. So it's not only multidimensional, it's multi-layered. So think about the center of the circle where the individual is. They're part of these overlapping circles of individuals, faculty, staff, friends, family, even if they're not close, classmates, teammates. You can think about a bunch of other small circles that people are part of. There's an intersection. So they have connections to people in all these circles. But all of this happens within these larger contexts. So think about the context of an institution. So I'm at a very small, private, tuition-driven institution. We have less than 5,000 students. I did my undergrad and first master's degree at Michigan State University. When I was there, 33,000 students. When I started at New England College, the entire campus fit in the residence hall I lived in my freshman year. Very different. And that has an impact on belonging and the ability to connect. And these institutions, they exist within a geographic location. So at New England College, we're in kind of rural New Hampshire. We're about 25 minutes from the closest city, and that's really not a city in New Hampshire. You know, we have small cities. We don't even have a stoplight in our town. We have a four-way stop. That's it. We don't even have a bar in a college town. We have restaurants that have bars, but we don't have a standalone bar. And if you live in a college town, there are typically many bars. And so there's really not a lot going on. And the other thing is, we're the most diverse institution in New Hampshire. Even though we have about 6% people of color, our campus has 40% students of color. And we're in rural New Hampshire. So think about the impact of that on sense of belonging. And we don't have public transportation in New Hampshire, like in other places. We don't even have a shuttle that goes to our cities. So think about the isolation. We're also pulling students from New York City, Chicago, LA. So imagine coming from a very urban area to a very rural area in a state that's very white. So all of that has an impact. And I'm not even talking about policies and laws in states that may have an impact on belonging. So this is Strayhorn's work. So Terrell Strayhorn has really kind of been a trailblazer in the idea of belonging with college students. And he centered all this work on in Maslow's hierarchy and thinking about where students are coming to our institution and where they're going. And how do we help them move through this area of self-actualization? But keeping in mind that if we can't manage some of those bottom level needs of students, they can't even get to the belonging piece of it, let alone the higher levels. And that's where we start to see the connection to retention and persistence. Do you know how many students on your campus are food insecure? How many people know that number? How many people know the number of students on your campus who don't have housing? If we can't really focus on some of those bottom level things, how do we expect them to succeed academically? But again, we have to do those things before we can even move on to belonging and then retention. When you take a look at the literature, these are the kind of what I call the 4 buckets or 4 components of belonging. They fit into the social belonging piece of it, academic belonging, institutional belonging, and then familial belonging. And I'll break those down a little bit. So let's talk about the outcomes. The literature is very, very clear. Huge impact on academic outcomes, including GPA, academic integration, persistence, graduation, all those things. Very, very strong literature on that. And now we're starting to see some theories that build in belonging. So this is John Braxton's theory. He revised this for the Impact of Sense of Belonging book and built in belonging as both an outcome of social integration, but also having a direct impact on persistence. And so we're beginning to see this idea of belonging building into the retention models. But we really need to keep in mind, again, that this is a multidimensional construct, and belonging looks different for different students and is impacted differently for different students. So there's clearly an interaction between sense of belonging and student identity. Some students feel it differently, experience it differently. The factors or the influences are different for different types of students. And it is not equitable across all demographic groups. So let me give you kind of a quick summary. So for queer students, the key is validation, being validated in their identity. And if queer students do not feel that they're validated on campus, they're going to seek this validation off campus. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it's something we need to keep in mind. Native students, big issue connection with element of this is the connection to both people and place. Now, this could be a physical place. It could be for individuals, it could be the tribal community. It could be the multicultural student office, or it could be the academic area for Native students or Indigenous studies. But the place piece is very important. And for Latinx students, the research suggests about the connection to their home communities. And this really more of a focus on connection. And this is where it makes me really think about higher education and the Western values and the systems and structures that we have in U.S. higher education. So U.S. higher education is based on Western beliefs about individuality, and it's influenced by capitalism and neoliberalism. So it's all about the individual. It's all about separation. Think about back to some of us when we were in college, this whole idea of in loco parentis. The key was separating students from their families so that they could develop. But that's a very Western belief. That may not be helpful for all of our students. Actually, staying connected to their families may be critical to their success, critical to their belonging. Black and African American students, this is where sense of safety is really important. Making sure that they feel safe, making sure that policies on campus are enforced equitably, thinking about this connection, and then also the research around Black students and sense of belonging is about thinking about these multiple layers, and they may feel connected in some places, but not in other places. So it's almost kind of like these nesting dolls, where students can feel connected maybe in the residence hall, but maybe not at the institution. Maybe at the institution, but not in the town. And this is an issue we had at New England College. About 8 years ago, when we started becoming more diverse, our police, our town police, who do you think they stopped? Our Black students. And so that had a huge impact on students' belonging. They felt like they belonged at our campus because our campus safety was fantastic. But the town police had not been prepared for that. And so they needed some additional training. But structural representation is critical. Students need to be able to see people who look like them, be able to connect with people who look like them. Not only students, but faculty and staff as well. Asian American students, again, it's a little bit different. It's about this connection to cultural values. So being with people who share similar values. Because engagement in and of itself doesn't foster a sense of belonging. And then social class. And there are multiple issues related to social class. So first of all, could be imposter syndrome. So I'm first generation college student from a working class background. Did well in high school, but wasn't really sure if I belonged in college. Neither of my parents had a college degree. It was really important to them. But because of this, I had to work 20 hours a week. That impacted what I could be involved in. I really wanted to be in a fraternity. Didn't have the money to do that. And so there are multiple impacts about class on sense of belonging. Think back to the involvement, engagement, and belonging connection. So if students don't have the money to be involved, that may hinder their belonging. If they have to work, that may hinder the amount of time they can be connected and engaged and involved. And then there's this idea about English language learners. And this is one thing I hadn't thought about until I read this a little bit more. Because there's this idea about academic English. So we have some students who where English is not their primary language. They may be able to speak English, but not academic English. And because of that, they may feel invisible. They may be hesitant to speak up, to build connections, which can relate to belonging. On-campus living. Big connection to belonging on campus. But living on campus in and of itself does not foster belonging. How many people lived on campus when they were in college? Yeah, a lot of folks. I felt very connected to my residence hall floor, but not all people think that. You know, when I was a hall director, I had a lot of conversation with students who didn't feel like they belonged on their floor for one reason or another. But the key elements to fostering belonging through on-campus living is about creating an environment where students feel like they can get connected. Being very intentional with the programming. So the programming is about helping students feel connected to each other. Sometimes we call that forced fun. Staff are critical. Because staff, for many students, are the first connection they make to a professional on campus, particularly for first-year students. So knowing students' names, knowing how to pronounce their names correctly, using their names as often as possible are critical. And the other thing, particularly for first-year students and even more especially for first-generation students, staff are the link to resources on campus. When I was a hall director, our associate director talked about what she called the tinkertory theory. And she said, residence hall staff, both professional and paraprofessional, are the hub. So think back to the tinker toys you played with when you were kids. They're the hub. Because not only can they connect students in the residence hall to other students, they connect them to the resources. They're the ones who know students on their floors and in their building who may be from similar towns, similar states, similar interests, similar academic disciplines. So the staff are the ones that connect the students. They're the binding agent. And then the policies. And this is where that sense of safety and sense of community come from. And so staff have to ensure that they're enforcing policies and doing it equitably and fairly. So sense of place and space. So one of my doctoral students who'll be graduating in December, he did his dissertation on belonging and space and place. And he's native, he's indigenous, so he used an indigenous research paradigm, which was fascinating. But what he learned from his research is that there is a huge connection between belonging and space and place. And that space and place could be physical, it could be virtual, it could be an office on campus, such as the Multicultural Student Office. One student he interviewed talked about feeling like they belonged on the basketball court because they'd always played basketball. They were on the basketball team. Another student a woman talked about feel like she belonged in the lab because she felt like that was her niche. Another student talked about just being on the green and taking a look at the mountains, feeling like they belonged in that bigger place. Sometimes it's the location alone. Sometimes the location and the people. But it's all about this feeling of connection. How many people feel connected to a space or a place? For me, it's Acadia National Park. I love that place. It's just you feel so connected. Not just to that place, but to the universe. And what Benny talked about, he's talked about the 5 R's. These are the keys of building sense of belonging through space and place. First about is building this relationship. So students build a relationship with that space or that place. They have respect for it. It's very relevant to who they are. There's this reciprocity. that you have to give to that space, that place, that group of people, not just take that belonging. And there's a responsibility to make that space better than what it was when students got there. And so this is one thing I'm not sure we do a really good job of thinking about. And the other thing that goes back to the space piece and the place piece related to on-campus living and belonging is design. How often do we think about design of our spaces, our buildings, and the connection to sense of belonging? So when I was a hall director, I worked in an old building. The doors didn't automatically close, the room doors. Some people are smiling, which is great for building community. Not great for fire safety. But those are the things we need to think about. Do we create spaces on our campus for people to connect, either informally or formally? Are doors open? For faculty, is your door open when you're in the office, or is it closed? What are some of the terms and language we even use? Because I think about the term office hours. Some first-gen students may think that's time to actually not talk to a faculty member because that's when they're doing their work. So even the language is connected to space and place and messages it sends. So let me give you a couple examples of institutions who are doing work to foster a sense of belonging. First of all is Fitchburg State and their orientation program. So they're building on a brief belonging intervention, which I'll talk about in a second. But they focus on academic transitions, so students felt like they got connected to the institution, got connected to faculty, so they weren't intimidated, fostered a growth mindset, so students felt like they could get better, with the ultimate goal of succeeding academically. And then they did this program around decoding college. So they actually had a glossary of all the acronyms that were used commonly on campus. When I was a first-year college student, I had no idea what a bursar was. No idea. So think about the terms, because higher ed is very jargony. We use terms that we all know, but do students know those? Do parents even know those? And also this idea of normalizing feeling like you don't belong. Particularly if students are going to a college where they don't already know somebody, they may not feel connected, and that's okay. But how do you normalize those feelings but also provide some strategies for students to feel like they belong? And then at the University of Maryland, they have an honors program. It's a living learning community, which is a high-impact practice, which is related to increasing sense of belonging, but also academic outcomes, including retention and persistence. But the key element of this is they were doing research with a faculty member, and it was over a long period of time. So if you look at the characteristics of high-impact practices, a couple of the key characteristics are working with a faculty or staff member and working with people over a long period of time so you can build those connections. And then not only were there mentors for these students then became mentors for others. And when they became mentors, that even strengthened the sense of belonging, because now they felt like they were giving back to the institution. They felt like they were helping other students like themselves. And that fostered some leadership opportunities. But even academically, there are opportunities for us to foster a sense of belonging. So some folks at the University of Wisconsin focused on how do we build belonging through online classes. Because students who have taken online classes may not feel that connected. How many people have taken an online class? Okay, a few people. When I've taken it, I haven't really felt like connected at all. Because you have those weekly discussion posts. Sometimes you don't know what the person looks like who you're writing to. You don't know if they're actually being sarcastic or if you really don't get that tone, those intonations through the discussion posts. So unless faculty are building in other tools, like using things like Flipgrid, where they actually video record their discussion posts, set up synchronous meetings or time to connect, they may not feel connected. And so what the research suggests is really, how do we build community? How do we build connections through the online classes? And actually, all these suggestions apply to in-person classes as well. But really being thoughtful and intentional about building those connections. Again, like I mentioned before, knowing students' names, knowing how to pronounce them correctly, using them frequently, little things like that can foster a sense of belonging. So let me talk to you a little bit about a social belonging intervention, because I think this is a powerful, easy to use intervention to foster a sense of belonging and those academic outcomes that we talked about. So this is based on a ton of research by Cohen and his colleagues, and it's just a 30-minute intervention. It can be done in person or even online, but there are three main components to it. So first of all, providing survey data around student sense of belonging. So students feeling like they belong. Stories from older students talking about how they struggled at first to feel like they belonged, but later they felt more connected. And including some ways that they did that. It was either joining a student organization, it was working with a faculty member to do research, leading their broomball team to the institutional championship. And then also this final element where actually the students completing this intervention write stories to future students about their thoughts. So this really kind of solidifies the idea that even though they feel like they may not belong right now, they feel like they're going to in the future. And the outcomes are huge and been demonstrated in study after study. Increases student confidence, first-year grades, first-year completion. And the impact of these are even more powerful for minoritized students. So we started doing this at New England College this fall. And this is actually part of a research study we're doing with James Madison University and SUNY Geneseo. And we're building it into our first-year seminar. And so all of our incoming students take a first-year seminar, which really helps them get connected to the resources, develop some academic skills. And it's adapted based on a belonging intervention from PERTS.net. So I can't remember what PERTS stands for, but they've actually developed this free online intervention that anybody can use. We chose not to do it because we couldn't collect data from that, but we kind of mirrored what they did. What they did is they created these stories from older students and then just built it into a Qualtrics survey. And students would go through this Qualtrics survey and then complete some questions at the end. And so we built it similarly through our Qualtrics platform. We had 2 intervention groups because we wanted to kind of have they weren't necessarily a control and intervention group. We wanted to provide the intervention at 2 different times. So one group got the intervention the first half of the semester, and we just started our second half, so the other group is getting it right now. And then we measured sense of belonging before the term started, the first week, at midterm, and then we'll do it in the final week of the class. We're also going to do it in the spring and see if there are differences in student sense of belonging. We actually created a 45-item composite survey instrument to gather some of the information. We're using a number of scales. So first of all, we're using a belonging uncertainty scale, which Walton and Cohen used. So if students feel like, are they uncertain if they're going to belong at all? An ability uncertainty scale. Do they feel like they have the ability to succeed there? The University Belonging Questionnaire, which has 3 elements: connection to the institution itself, do they feel supported by the institution, and then connections with faculty and staff. We're using 2 subscales from the National Survey of Student Engagement. There is a belonging scale, which is 3 items, as well as a safety scale, which is 3 items. And then we created some homegrown items, one around place and space, institutional commitment, because one of the challenges we have at New England College is NEC is not most of our students' first choice. It's their 3rd, 4th, or 5th. And when we look at some of the retention models, the initial commitment to the institution has an impact on retention as well as a subsequent commitment to the institution. And then social integration. To what extent are they involved and engaged on campus? So we're hoping to learn some things in the spring. We'll write that up and publish that. But the intervention itself is very promising. Very easy to implement, very easy to do. So with that, let me give you some strategies. So you say, well, the intervention's great. I don't have power, I don't have control to do something like that on campus, but are there things that I can do? So I'm going to give you 10 strategies for each of these categories. So first of all, in regard to social belonging, first of all, figure out ways to facilitate connections between faculty, staff, and students. Don't just assume social events are going to naturally lead to connections. We have to be really intentional here. This is where we have to move away from, do the students fit the institution, to how the institutions fit all of the students. Because I believe if we admit students, we have an obligation to help them succeed. So that means the institutions have to make some changes to support students. Creating identity-based engagement opportunities. It could be student organizations, it could be dinners for students to get connected, but building that connection between communities around student identity has been supported by research to foster a sense of belonging. Mentoring programs, tons of research supports that in terms of academic outcomes, but also belonging. This idea of breaking bread, so even just having meals. So at a previous campus, we had a first-generation initiative where first-gen alumni would come back to campus for dinners with first-gen students. You know, another dinner was with first-gen faculty members and first-gen students. Another dinner was with first-gen students and first-gen staff. And then we had a huge gathering with all the first-gen students. So again, they can be really easy things. Don't need to cost a ton of money. Peer support groups, where we really use the students to support each other. Normalize the challenges to belonging. Let students know it's okay to feel like you don't belong, and that's going to improve. Have students tell their stories. Share their stories of perhaps how they struggled. Do a poster session on student stories. Creating social media groups, creating those connections virtually may be helpful. Community-based competitions. When I was a hall director, we did floor Olympics. So we had floors compete against other floors on a variety of different things. And then once we had the winner of the building, then there was the inter-building Olympics. And that really built connection because students really connected with each other on their floor. And then even regardless if students' floor didn't win, there was this building identity that was fostered. And then service projects are a great way to get connected. So academic belonging, like I mentioned, the easiest thing that can be done is knowing students' names. When I first started teaching and I didn't know students, I took index cards, big index cards, have them folded in half, and write their name on it. So I could see their names, but other students could see each other's names as well. So think about strategies for helping students learn each other's names, but to learn their names. Embracing a constructivist approach to learning. Moving away from the banking model that Paulo Freire talks about, where the instructor just dispenses and deposits knowledge into students. Think about creating opportunities where students co-create the knowledge with each other as well as with the instructor. I love this approach because I learn a ton that I wouldn't learn normally. Think about inclusive pedagogies, culturally responsive pedagogy, culturally sustaining pedagogy, culturally revitalizing pedagogy, anti-racist pedagogy, decolonizing pedagogy. Those are ways to build inclusion and belonging. When students start to see their identities in the authors that they're reading in class, and the topics that they're covering in class. And this applies across disciplines, not just humanities and social sciences. Implementing high-impact practices. So taking a look at George Koo and his colleagues, multiple ways to do that. And this idea of developing academic identity, feeling that they're connected, particularly in STEM, where we have a number of minoritized students and women underrepresented in STEM. Building this connection where students feel like that discipline is what they want to go into. Facilitating study groups. As faculty or academic program directors, creating these intentionally. Sometimes they happen organically, which is great, but creating those opportunities intentionally. Because if we really want to foster a sense of belonging, it's all about being intentional. Think about academic networking, connecting students with faculty, staff in the discipline, with alumni who are doing work in that area, so they begin to think about what does that career look like from my major. Another easy thing to do that builds sense of belonging based on the research, providing thoughtful, supportive, and timely feedback. I'm really good at the timely piece of it. I'm not really good about the positive piece of it. So I got to get better at that. But helping, giving feedback to students, like things that they're doing right, not just what they're doing wrong, and ways to improve. And developing micro-credentials. And to me, this is a key opportunity for retention and persistence. How many folks have micro-credentials on their campus? A handful. One thing that frustrates me about U.S. higher education, it's one of the fewest commodities where you get nothing until you walk across that stage. You could leave with tens of thousands of dollars in debt when you leave an institution and get nothing for it. And when we have policies that don't allow students to get their transcripts unless they paid their bill, we then hold that transcript hostage. But if we can think about micro-credentials, where students, even if they leave our institution, get something to demonstrate to employers, and I'll be quite frank, a college degree only demonstrates that students sat in a class for a certain number of hours and passed some assignments. The degree itself does not demonstrate learning, but micro-credentials can. And again, micro-credentials are another way to not only support retention and persistence, but student learning, and provide students the opportunities to be able to demonstrate to employers and to grad schools skills and knowledge they have. But it also fosters a sense of belonging. We have to address student basic needs as an institution. But at first, we need the data to understand what percentage of our students are food insecure. Putting up a pantry is not in and of itself is going to work, because what we see from the research is even students who are food insecure are not going to utilize that pantry because of stigma. So we need to be thoughtful. We need to improve our interventions around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, I understand that's a challenge in some states and in some cities, given laws, but this is where belonging provides a wonderful opportunity. Because what I'm seeing is in the states where there are laws against DEI or dismantling DEI offices, the language is now, the interventions are being reframed around belonging. Does the same stuff. And then prioritizing, normalizing, and supporting students' mental health if we want them to succeed. Again, thinking about Maslow's hierarchy, if we don't fulfill their basic needs, if we don't help them address mental health issues, and these aren't just people with diagnosed mental health issues, even just stress, anxiety, that's going to impact their academic success. And then ensuring safety and security. How do we make sure that students feel safe on campus? And I'm sure if you read in the Chronicle of Higher Education or Inside Higher Ed, there are a number of issues happening right now with institutions who are not doing a good job with that. And then also perhaps creating an app to help students get connected to resources, help them know what's going on to campus. Trying to personalize transactional processes. So I mentioned the bursar a couple times. What are your transactional processes like on your campus? I think about conversations I have with doctors' offices. I call and say, I have a question. What's your name, birth date? It's pretty impersonal. But when I called my cable company the other day, who do I have the pleasure of speaking with today? Gavin Henning. How are you doing today? I'm doing great. You know, and they look up something. Well, I'm looking this up. How was your weekend? Now, of course, I know they don't really care about that. They're just trying to be nice. But I appreciated that. To what extent do we do that on campus? You know, when students go into the financial aid office, or they go to the registrar's office, or they go somewhere else, how are they greeted? Do those folks ask students' names? Do they use those names? Well, Gavin, I hope we answered your question today. Do you have anything else to come up with? Enjoy your day. If you have any other questions, my name is so-and-so. Feel free to contact me directly. I love when people do that. Because what I hate is when I call up something. Our menu has changed. Please listen to all options. And then what's even worse is you get the recording. I can answer your questions. I'm a chatbot. How often do we do that to students? Now, there's certainly benefits to chatbots, but there's not that personal connection. And so how do we provide both the chatbots for easy access to resources, but also those personal connections through processes that are mainly transactional? Think about spotlighting students, highlighting things that they do. Providing institutionally branded items. So as I said, I went to Michigan State University. I've got a ton of Michigan State stuff. My license plate is Spartan, and I even have a Spartan tattoo to prove it. Because I am connected to Michigan State, which makes me really frustrated about what's going on campus right now. And when I started at New England College in 2012, nobody was wearing New England College sweatshirts. And I knew that was impacting students' institutional connections. Now, students are wearing them all the time. But how do we actually kind of further that? How do we kind of nudge that? We can give them free stuff. A free t-shirt with the institution's name on it can go a long way. And getting students connected to alumni. Not only can they learn what alumni are doing, but that gives them one more institutional connection, one more support. And as an alumnus who's done alumni networking, I love it. Because I want to give back to my institution. I want to give back to the students who are attending there now. And we can't forget about the connection with family. Because for a lot of our students, that connection is really strong. So how do we support that? How do we create family events on campus? More than just family weekend. How do we move away from just this one-year event? Think about family advisory committees, getting families connected that way. Implementing a letter writing campaign where parents, family members, guardians write letters to their students. In the age of email and text, a letter is really special. You know, when I was an undergrad, before all that, I loved getting a letter from my mom. Or that care package, but it only just came around the holidays. How are there opportunities to initiate things where students can actually get care packages multiple times a year? Creating a strategy list for family members, ways they can stay connected, but do this for students as well, how they can stay connected to their families. Think about immersion trips where families are involved. So we have a ton of these for students, you know, where a faculty or a staff member or multiple faculty or staff members will take students to some place If it's around marine biology, it could be to the Galapagos. If it's around history, it could be to Prague. How cool would it be if families went on these immersion trips and got to learn together? That could be really special. Not only helping students stay connected to their family members, but also to the institution. Tapping into the knowledge of family members, having them provide webinars. After my father retired, he took up carving. He's a master carver for birds and fish. And I think people might be interested to know, like, how do you do that? How do you start with a block of wood and turn it into a cardinal? But there are other ways we can involve family members that way. And then also this idea about genealogy research. Having families trace their history together. So let me wrap up with a few main points. First of all, belonging and inputs, environment, and outputs. So really based on the work of Alexander Aston. So students come in with these characteristics and identities, and that impacts belonging. We want them to succeed. We want them to stay. We want them to graduate. And frankly, if one of my master's students goes to a different institution to graduate, I'm okay with that because I want them to graduate. But what happens in the black box of our institutions? What are we doing intentionally to create environments, climates, where students feel like they belong? Belonging is like an onion. You can keep peeling it away. It's multidimensional, multi-layered, which can be intimidating and paralyzing in some ways. But the more we know about it, the more we can do to support it. Huge impact between belonging and academic success. And as I mentioned, student identity, characteristics, and experiences impact belonging, and is different for students from different groups. And relationships matter. How do we think about building intentionally build relationships with students? And not forgetting that spaces and places matter. How do we think about design features and how they can support belonging? And institutions must be intentional. Because really, we have to play an active role for our students to belong if we really want them to succeed. So hopefully there were some key takeaways. Let me throw up the QR code again in case you didn't get that, because that actually has all the slides and all the strategies, as well as a ton of the resources you might be interested in. And that is all I have this morning.
So Gavin, we have a little something for you if you want to come back up. On behalf of CSRDE and even NSSR, you'd be surprised how many times you were quoted in all of these papers that we read. So we're so thankful that you came and helped us out by presenting and being an amazing keynote speaker. So one more time, thank you.